In 1945, as the smoke of World War II cleared, the world exhaled in a collective sigh of relief. But the peace was a lie. What followed was not a return to normalcy, but the birth of a terrifying new reality. Two titans, the United States and the Soviet Union, stood face to face, divided by an invisible iron curtain. Imagine a world where the push of a single red button could erase entire civilizations in less than 30 minutes. A world of secret codes, invisible spies, and a desperate race to the stars. From the freezing streets of a divided Berlin to the sweltering jungles of Vietnam and the heart-stopping 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the human race lived in the constant shadow of a nuclear sunrise. In this film, we unearth the dark archives of a conflict that was never fought with bullets between the giants, but threatened to end history itself. This is the story of how we survived the impossible. This is the total chronicle of the Cold War. Welcome to the War Archives. Let the history begin. In May 1945, the guns in Europe finally fell silent. The Thousand-Year Reich was in ruins, its cities reduced to ash and its leaders either dead or in chains. To the common soldier shaking hands at the Elbe River, it seemed like the dawn of a new peaceful age. But beneath the celebrations, a far more dangerous shadow was stretching across the globe. The uneasy alliance between the democratic West and the communist East, forged in the fires of necessity to defeat Hitler, was already beginning to unravel. What followed was not a traditional war of bullets and bayonets, but a silent, suffocating rivalry that would dominate the next half-century. It was a struggle waged on political, economic, and propaganda fronts. A chess match where the stakes were nothing less than the total annihilation of the human race. The English writer George Orwell was the first to give this era a name in 1945. He called it a Cold War, a nuclear stalemate between monstrous superstates, each possessing a weapon by which millions of people could be wiped out in a few heartbeats. This is the story of that stalemate. This is the story of the two titans who divided the world in two. The Iron Curtain descends by early 1948. The mask of wartime cooperation had completely slipped. The Soviet Red Army, which had liberated Eastern Europe from the Nazis, did not leave. Instead, under the iron fist of Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union began installing puppet regimes in Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania. In Washington and London, fear began to take root. The Americans and the British watched with growing alarm as the liberated democracies of the East were transformed into satellite states of the Kremlin. Stalin was determined to maintain a buffer zone to safeguard Russia against any future threat from the West, while simultaneously fueled by an ideological drive to spread communism to every corner of the earth. In 1947, the American financier and presidential advisor Bernard Baruch stood at the State House in South Carolina and echoed Orwell's warning. "Let us not be deceived," he said. "We are today in the midst of a Cold War." The lines were officially drawn in 1947 and 48. The United States launched the Marshall Plan, a massive multi-billion-dollar aid package to rebuild the shattered economies of Western Europe. It was a masterstroke of economic warfare, bringing those nations firmly under American influence. In response, Stalin solidified his grip on the East, sealing the borders. As Winston Churchill famously declared, an iron curtain had descended across the continent, the peak of tension and the atomic monopoly. The period between 1948 and 1953 saw the Cold War reach its first terrifying peak. The first major flashpoint was Berlin. Deep inside the Soviet-held sector of East Germany, the city was divided. In 1948, Stalin attempted to starve the Western-held sectors into submission by cutting off all land access. The Berlin Blockade was the first true test of Western resolve. For nearly a year, Allied pilots flew thousands of missions in the Berlin Airlift, delivering food and coal to a besieged city until Stalin finally blinked and lifted the blockade in 1949. That same year, two events rocked the American psyche to its core. First, the United States and its allies formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, a unified military command designed to resist Soviet aggression. But just months later, the unthinkable happened. Far out in the Siberian desert, a mushroom cloud rose over a Soviet test site. The Soviet Union had exploded its first atomic warhead. The American monopoly on the bomb was over. The nuclear arms race had begun. The world map continued to bleed red. In 1949, Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communists seized power in mainland China, turning the world's most populous nation into a Soviet ally. The conflict then turned hot in 1950. In a move supported by the Kremlin, Communist North Korea invaded U.S.-supported South Korea. For 3 long, bloody years, the two superpowers fought a proxy war on the Korean peninsula, ending in 1953 with a jagged line of barbed wire that remains to this day. Brinkmanship and the Cuban Crisis. The death of Joseph Stalin in 1953 brought a brief, flickering hope of relaxation, but the structural divide was too deep. In 1955, the Soviet bloc formed its own military alliance, the Warsaw Pact. That same year, West Germany was admitted into NATO, cementing the division of Europe. As the late 1950s arrived, the race moved from the Earth to the stars. Both superpowers began developing intercontinental ballistic missiles, rockets capable of carrying nuclear death across oceans in less than 30 minutes. The most dangerous moment in human history arrived in October 1962. The Soviet Union began secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. For 13 days, the world held its breath as President John F. Kennedy and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev engaged in a high-stakes game of nuclear chicken. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the two superpowers to the very edge of the abyss. For the first time, both sides looked directly into the face of mutual atomic annihilation and realized that no one would win a nuclear war. The missiles were withdrawn, and in 1963, they signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, banning above-ground testing. But the shock of the crisis changed the Soviet leadership. Humiliated by their perceived military inferiority, they began a massive buildup of conventional and nuclear forces, a buildup that would drain their economy for decades. Your proxy wars and the shattering blows. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, the superpowers avoided direct combat in Europe. Instead, they fought shadow wars in the Third World. The Soviets sent tanks into East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and eventually Afghanistan to crush any hint of defection. The United States, governed by the containment policy, intervened in Guatemala, the Dominican Republic, and Grenada. But the greatest American trauma was Vietnam. From 1954 to 1975, the U.S. undertook a long and ultimately unsuccessful effort to prevent Communist North Vietnam from bringing the South under its rule. It was a war that tore the American social fabric apart and showed the limits of superpower coercion. However, by the late 1960s, the simple bipolar world began to fracture. A massive split occurred between the Soviet Union and China in 1960, destroying the unity of the communist bloc. Meanwhile, Japan and Western Europe achieved miraculous economic growth, reducing their dependence on the United States. The world was no longer a two-player game. It was becoming a complex web of independent powers. Détente and the final collapse. The 1970s offered a moment of détente, an easing of tensions through the strategic arms limitation talks known as SALT. Treaties were signed in 1972 and 1979 to set limits on the number of nuclear missiles. But this peace was short-lived. The early 1980s saw a renewed chill as both sides engaged in one last massive arms buildup. The end came not with a bang, but with a series of internal fractures. In the late 1980s, a new kind of Soviet leader emerged, Mikhail Gorbachev. Recognizing that the Soviet system was economically stagnant and morally exhausted, he began a series of democratic reforms. Gorbachev's decision to dismantle totalitarianism allowed the long-suppressed voices of Eastern Europe to rise. In 1989 and 90, the communist regimes of Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany collapsed like a house of cards. Gorbachev surprisingly allowed them to fall without sending in the tanks. The momentum was unstoppable. On December 31, 1991, the Soviet Union formally ceased to exist. 15 new independent countries emerged from the ruins, including Russia, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. The Berlin Wall was gone. The Iron Curtain had been torn down. The Cold War was over. It ended without a nuclear exchange, but it left behind a world forever changed by 5 decades of fear, innovation, and a relentless struggle for the soul of humanity. Conclusion and call to action. The Cold War was more than a rivalry. It was a period that pushed humanity to the edge of its own existence. It defined our technology, our politics, and our borders. If you found this archive of the Cold War insightful, please support the channel by hitting the like button. Share this documentary with those who seek to understand how the world we live in today was forged. What is your perspective? Was the Cold War inevitable, or could it have been avoided at the end of 1945? Let us know in the comments below. To continue exploring the deepest archives of human conflict, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Thank you for watching the War Archives. Until next time, keep exploring the past.